Hi, it's been a while since I talked about military strategy on this channel, so I thought that for this video I would try to do sort of an introduction to the thought of General Vincent Desportes, who is recently retired general. He is one of the leading French military thinkers today. He's also he's like a talking head in French TV and whatnot, and he's published a whole bunch of books, most of which I've read, plus articles. Anyways, he's really super interesting. Also, among other things, between 2005 and 2008, Desportes was the commander of what was called at the time the Centre de Doctrine et de l'Emploi des Forces, or CDEF, which was at the time sort of like a French Army doctrine and strategy think tank that's at the École Militaire. It still exists, but they changed the name because why not? But anyways, he really helped preside and promoted this whole period of, I think, like a real renewal of French strategic thinking that took place in the 2000s and the 2010s, and he was really a big player for that. Anyways, he's super important and really very interesting, so I want to talk about him in this video. My name is Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. Okay, so Desportes, I have not met the man, but we have exchanged a few emails. Very nice, very, very polite. I also wrote about him for War on the Rocks back in 2018. I put a link in the description to that article. I've also put links to his different books and some of his articles also in the subscription, so that you can peruse. I believe that there's been some controversy lately about some of the stuff that he's been saying recently about NATO and Europe and Ukraine and Russia, but I don't find what he said to be particularly controversial. And either way, I haven't been tracking that much. I'm not really going to get into that. I'm much more interested in his work, the stuff that he's published. I have the books here, and I've read most of his books, and plus a whole bunch of articles. The main book, probably the most useful one, is this book called Comprendre la guerre, or Understand War. It's quite good. You can see I've made some notes. I also have Deciding in the Dark, which was translated into English. And another book that was translated to English is this book, La Guerre Probable. I believe the English version of this has the exact same cover, and the title is called, I think, The Next War. Also quite good, very interesting. And then I've got this book here, Entrer en Stratégie, Enter in Strategy. It's like a good intro to strategy. It's all good stuff. I think that perhaps one way to sort of think about Desportes is, I mean, he wrote a lot of stuff, and but he's mainly a theorist of this sort of interesting period between the end of the Cold War and, I would say, 2022, with the full-blown Russian invasion, and thinking about warfare and conflict. This is sort of during the day and the age of the Iraq War, the Afghanistan, global war on terror, sort of trying to understand it, and also it's at a time when it looks almost like state-on-state conventional warfare sort of all but dead. So he's thinking about warfare, and he's thinking about modern warfare, and he's thinking about how all of this sort of works, and I think that's really sort of the time frame. And now it's going to be interesting to see, like 10 years from now with Ukraine war, whether or not strategic thinking and military thinking is going to change in any significant way. Anyways, Desportes wrote a lot. He said a lot. But so if I had to sum up Desportes, he asked me, held a gun to my head and said, okay, you need to summarize Desportes like on one foot. What would it be? And I think I'd have to say the following. Okay, now I just want to preface, as sort of a warning. Some of what Desportes said, it seems self-evident, and you'll be like, well, of course. But it's almost, the problem is that like it's so self-evident that people don't even actually bother to say it, or even to think it, or to go through the trouble of thinking about what it actually means. And thus often what Desportes is saying, he's saying really loudly, like he's saying as loudly as he possibly can so that everybody in the back row can hear him. And it's sort of like, you're going to say, all right, yeah, I know this, but have you really thought about it? Or have you actually tried to apply this idea that everybody says that they know, and they're like, yeah, whatever. No. Like, stop and think about it and try to apply it. Okay, so point number one. Military strategy, according to Desportes, requires a strict alignment of ends, ways, and means. If the means are inadequate or inappropriate, then you have to change them, or maybe you have to change your ends. Otherwise, the whole gambit, whatever you're trying to do with the military force, is going to fail. You have to adjust the ends to align them better. You have to adjust the means. You have to change one of these things. They all have to be in strict alignment. Number two, Clausewitz's famous dictum, and he's really into Clausewitz, is that this idea that politics, we all know, all right, war is politics by other means. Now, what this does not mean is that once you choose to go to war, you leave politics behind. On the contrary, what it means is that the purpose of war is ultimately political. The end objective, what you're looking to achieve through war, has to be a political end state, which means you have to be able to define what your political end state is. So, and it follows for Desportes that it's up to civilians to define the political goals, and military leaders, their job is then to figure out how military action can contribute to the achievement of the political objective. And he believes that anytime military leaders have free rein to define ultimately for the civilian leaders what the political objectives are, and ultimately confuse military objectives with political objectives, disaster will ensue. Point 3. Perhaps the real art of war for Desportes is the challenging task of figuring out how military force can be applied such that it helps achieve the political end state. So, what can military force actually achieve? Can it really achieve the desired political end state? And how can it be applied such that it will help achieve the political end state? This is huge. Right, and this is, again, one of those things I don't think people really do nearly often enough. Part 4. I think this is really huge for understanding Desportes, particularly this idea, this book here, La Guerre Probable, the next war, right, the probable war. What is future conflict going to look like? He says that once upon a time, the presumption was that decisive military action could often yield the desired political outcome, the desired political end state, meaning that you have a tactical advantage, you win the battle, this results in a strategic advantage, you win the war, and this results in bringing about the political end state that you want. But he says that nowadays, that's very seldom the case. It's more likely than not to be the case where a political military advantage, a decisive battle, might help bring about a political end state, but only alongside other kinds of action. And so military action is just one tool of many among many. It might be necessary, but it's almost never going to be sufficient for achieving the stated political end. Now, because of this background in which it had always in the past been assumed that military action yields decisive strategic wins, he says that Western militaries, led by the Americans, have been going in a direction that's really the contrary of the way conflict has been going in modern war. So, for example, he says that Western militaries, again, led by the Americans, have always understood warfare in terms of a duel of firepower and technology. So the idea is that the more firepower and the more tech, the better you are at using your firepower, the more likely you are to win the war, right? Because winning the battle means winning the war. That's the assumption. And Western militaries have gotten exceptionally good at blowing things up with precision and ideally from a safe distance. Now, the problem is that the ability to do this better than your opponent, more often than not, makes no difference whatsoever. I mean, just look at Vietnam, look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq. The fact that you can do this, that you're better than anybody else at blowing people up with precision at a safe distance, does not translate into actual victory. Tactical battlefield victories tend to mean nothing, and if anything, they might even be counterproductive. Yet, we keep going to war with militaries that are designed to be able to do this, designed to be better at blowing stuff up than other armies, which means that we go to war with militaries that are not useful. That's a serious problem. Technology, he says, so this is my 6th point, is a trap. Modern conflicts do not require that militaries be best at blowing stuff up using technology. So, but because this is the logic that we're in, we keep thinking that we just need more technology. The more tech we have, the better we are at blowing things up, as if that actually made a difference. Now, what militaries do need, he says, are numbers. more people on the ground. You need to be able to hold ground. You need to be able to control territory. The focus on technology. So already things he says were bad enough with the so-called peace dividend after the end of the Cold War, which Desportes says it was a really terrible idea. But this emphasis on technology is even worse because the tech costs money. And because it costs so much money, this means that you can have fewer things. And it gets one locked in this sort of logic of the belief that victory can be found in being better at blowing stuff up. Therefore, you're going to invest in more technology, so you're going to get better at this. And you get locked in this logic that just takes you further and further away from reality. He says thus, for example, that the so-called revolution of military affairs in the 1980s, 1990s, according to Desportes, that was a complete disaster. And it actually results in militaries that are impotent, and which is sort of a very striking thought. Now, 7, and this might be where we get to the controversial stuff. Desportes believes that military alliances, above all NATO, have been disastrous for Europe because they have encouraged Europeans to rely on American security guarantees and to disinvest from their own security. One result, he says, that Europe no longer has any influence because you don't have any influence, according to Desportes, if you don't have any hard power. The other is that ultimately Europe doesn't have any security. Because if you're relying on the Americans to protect you, you're going to be disappointed because the Americans won't. You can't count on the Americans to do that. He talks about Saving Private Ryan, and he's the myth of Saving Private Ryan, the idea that the Americans are going to send their boys to save your lives. He says it's just not true. It's not going to happen. And it's insane to imagine that the Americans are going to keep doing this. I mean, they did it in 1917, 1918. They did it in 1940, 41, 44, 45, right? But why assume that they're going to do it again? And it's just it's crazy. It's dangerous. For Desportes thinking that you need to get defense spending back up to Cold War levels, or at least 3% of GDP, and you have to invest in numbers and in size. Maybe you should have a draft. And you can't just shoot tech, right? He's not a Luddite, but there needs to be some sort of happy medium with the way tech is developed. Okay, so now let's back up a little bit. Okay, and I setting aside the Europe and NATO stuff, I want to focus on aligning ends, this argument about aligning ends in ways and means. This, as I said before, this seems self-evident. I mean, you hear this and you say, like, well, duh, right? Of course. The thing is that however self-evident it is, but perhaps because it's so self-evident, it's never said, and it seems very rare that for people to actually go through the trouble of thinking this through, right? What actually is the political end state that we want? How actually can military action bring about this desired political end state? And if you see that you're doing something, we're bombing the Houthis, we're doing this, we're doing that, does this actually achieve it? Have we defined an objective? And have we aligned with this objective the means and the ways that are going to bring about this political objective? I mean, there's so many examples that you can pick from these days. So, by the way, one thing that Desportes says about about Ukraine, is he says, like, he's pro-Ukraine, by the way. He's not one of these characters who's like, enthralled with Russia. Not at all. But he's critical of the European stance vis-a-vis Ukraine and the Russian stance vis-a-vis Ukraine. And he says, ultimately it's doomed to fail because there's no end state. Like, Europeans haven't figured out what they wanted to achieve. And if you haven't figured out what the desired political end state is, you're going to be in trouble. And then talks about how the means and the ends have not really been aligned with the end state. First of all, they don't know what the end state is. And as far as means and ways and all that, what the Europeans have been doing is cobbling together this sort of random collection of equipment and weapons and whatnot and kind of shipping it over to Ukraine, whether it makes any sense or not, right? Whether it makes any sense with respect to the execution of a strategy, if there were a strategy. Instead, he uses the word, it's like a hardware store full of just random things, whatever the Europeans are like, oh, here's some tanks and some this and some that, and but it's not, the decisions about what to get are not based on strategy. The decisions about what to hand over to Ukraine is based on 1,001 considerations, none of which have to do with strategy. But more to the point, you could also look at other conflicts. There's news every day now about the American bombing campaign against the Houthis in Yemen. I shed no tears whatsoever for the Houthis. But you also have to ask, what exactly is the political end state we're looking for? And is bombing them going to achieve anything? I'm inclined to think that it won't, that that's just not going to cut it. I think we've seen now far too many examples of how airstrikes really accomplish very little, but then also accomplish very little, in particular against a foe like the Houthis, who really don't care, right? Like, oh, you blow up a port, that means people will suffer. I don't think they really care. You could also apply this to the Gaza war, which is something I defend and justify, and I think it's an entirely legitimate war. On the other hand, it's very fair to ask serious questions. What is the political end state that the Israelis hope to achieve? Because they themselves haven't seemed to work this out. I mean, the Israelis say that they want to get rid of Hamas, but they don't want the Palestinian Authority. So who's actually going to govern in Gaza if they don't want to do it themselves? So what's the point? And do the military activities actually help bring about the political end state? Not that they figured out what the political end state has to be or should be. So it's really very problematic from a strategic point of view. There's another thing that I should bring up with respect to Gaza that Desportes talks a lot about. Now, I don't know if Desportes has actually spoken about Gaza. I'm sure he has. I maybe just have to Google more. But there is this thing where he does, particularly in this book, Comprendre la Guerre, where he's got this lengthy discussion about, let's say, the difference between direct and indirect strategy. And when he talks about direct strategy, he says that too often it just amounts to usury. He says user, which I guess maybe in American English you'd call like attrition. So it falls back on you win by blowing up more stuff than the enemy's stuff, and ideally you do it at a rate faster than you yourself suffer attrition. And he does say, as fond as he is of Foch and sort of the whole French school, he says, the French school ultimately is about usury. It's about, not usury, attrition. It's about the direct approach, direct strategy, just blowing stuff up and winning. And he says that he thinks that this is a mistake because ultimately it should be more about the indirect strategy, which he defines in terms of maneuver, and he defines in terms of thinking more creatively about how it is that you use military force in order to achieve your desired end state. So it might be just attacking, like in Patrick O'Brien, never mind the maneuvers, go straight at them. But very often it's not. It's about coming up with some clever indirect way of affecting some kind of pressure or leverage. Also, he writes a lot about the importance of morale and spirit and will, and like Foch, and both, he really thinks about how you only lose a war if you think you've lost a war, and the winner's the person who thinks that they've won. It's all about will. So you have to figure out, how do you affect the will and the morale of the combatants? How do you affect the will and the morale of the people who are supporting the combatants? What do you actually do? He doesn't believe in bombing civilians because he says it just doesn't work. So you have to come up with something more clever than that. So what? And that is the really hard part. And that, if you were to step back and look at so many of the conflicts that have been fought in the last 20, 30 years and beyond, I feel like people haven't done the homework that Desportes says you've got to do of figuring out what's the political end state, and then if you're going to use military power, military action in order to try to deliver that political end state, how really are you going to do it? And if your answer is just blowing stuff up, you're probably going to be disappointed. Thank you very much. Please, there's much more in the pipeline, so I look forward to seeing you in the next video. And again, if you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. In the description, I've put links to my article about Desportes that I wrote for War on the Rocks back in the day, plus some other stuff, plus the books that he's published that are available in French and English. And I've also put links to my Twitter, my Substack, also called Pax Americana, my Blue Sky, LinkedIn, and also my own website, michaelsherkin.com. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.